Hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about the King's Gambit starting after e4, e5, pawn to f4, e takes f4 is the King's Gambit accepted, and we're going to play the move knight to f3. And the subject of today's video is going to be about the Fischer Defense and the Muzio Gambit. And those two things are actually a lot more closely related than you might think, and we're just going to discuss exactly how you might want to build your King's Gambit repertoire to work around variations that you might want to try to avoid, or possibly to play variations that you're trying to get into because maybe you like other lines of the King's Gambit that you think are working out really well for you. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So, first things first, what's the Fischer Defense? What's the Muzio Gambit? So the Fischer Defense begins with d6, and the Fischer Defense kind of presents its own sort of opening problems for white. The Muzio Gambit happens very specifically after the main line, beginning with the move pawn to g5. The whole point being to just mechanically protect that shield pawn on the f4 square, and the Muzio Gambit happens after this move, bishop to c4, and then black doesn't play the move that just gives him a slight edge. Probably just bishop g7 should just be slight edge black. You know, bishop g7, and then, for example, h4, h6 should be slight edge black. Also probably just like something like d4. We could transpose back into the Fischer variation. d4, d6, and then h4, h6 could also be slight edge black as well. So instead of that, we're going to have black play this move pawn to g4. And this opens up this whole world into the Muzio Gambit. White just leaves the knight on f3 and just castles. And as far as I can tell, like, the Muzio Gambit itself is pretty good for white. Like, the positions are highly complicated, and it looks like these complications probably favor white. So Fischer, in his book My 6 Memorable Games, commented on the Muzio, claiming that it had been analyzed to a draw, and he simply gave the line g takes f3, queen f6 equal, with no further explanation, which of course is like annoying, and also it's like we're not really sure what he's referencing. Like, you know, he just said, oh, it's been worked out to a draw. Like, well, by who? What's the line? Like, give me a variation. So the only thing I could find that made any sense of maybe what worked out to a draw in Fischer's time, there was this one game played back in 1961 between Minnick and Sokolov, played in Zagreb, and that game continued e5, which is still the theory today. Queen takes e5, and then of course here a move that we don't play anymore, this move pawn to d3 is what was played in that game. So this is possibly what Fischer was referencing. And anyways, the game continued, bishop h6, and this is the other issue with the game. Like, by no means are any of these moves completely forced. So, like, we have bishop h6, knight c3, knight e7, bishop d2, knight c6, rook e1, queen f5, knight d5, king to d8, queen e2, queen e6, and then they repeated moves. Queen f3, queen f5, queen e2, queen e6, queen h5, queen g6, queen e2 with repetition. So this is the other problem. If this is the draw he was referencing, this wasn't even really a forced repetition. Like, somebody could have deviated, white or black, really, at some point could have deviated, especially black. According to the engine, like, there were a couple spots black could have easily deviated with something like slight edge black. So why are we repeating moves? I'm not sure. So if we go back to, just e5, queen takes e5, the move that we play today is not d3. The move we play today is this double sacrifice, this bishop takes f7. So bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and then we sacrifice a second pawn. We sacrifice d4. So all kinds of stuff getting sacrificed. Queen takes d4, and then bishop e3, taking advantage of the pin on the f4 square. Queen goes back to f6, and then simply bishop captures f4. So here we reach a really difficult moment for black. Black's king is extremely exposed and has no way of becoming unexposed, and it seems like white has more than enough compensation for the material. It seems like white's actually doing very, very well here. Maybe this is even advantage white. Even though if you put this into an engine, it'll usually immediately spit out, like, advantage black. But then every time you go deeper into each line, eventually it'll flip-flop and say this is advantage white. So it seems like these positions are actually quite good for white in spite of the engine analysis. So what should black play here? Well, black can develop with tempo, which is an option, and black can, of course, also just develop. Now, the issue is if black just develops and he doesn't gain a tempo, we do have this idea of playing knight c3 with the idea of bringing this knight to the d5 square. And the threat of knight c3 to d5 is actually a pretty huge one. If, for example, we just developed like knight c6, we would play knight to d5, and then after queen f5, we would just kick the queen off of this file, g4, and according to the engine, this is decisive advantage white. Once the queen leaves this file, the queen and the rook and the knight and the bishop and everything else are going to be able to attack this king with tempo and with force, and it's going to be game over. White's going to be winning. So we don't want to allow that. So people prefer to play this check, like bishop c5 check, king h1, and of course knight c3 to d5 is still a thing. It's still a threat, so how do we meet it? So one game where somebody actually tried to directly meet this threat was with this move, knight to e7. And the game we're following here is Jack Yost versus Baron, played in Toronto back in 2011. So Jack Yost playing the white pieces. He's a Minnesota player and probably one of the best King's Gambit players that I personally have ever met. He's a contemporary of mine. Well, not quite a contemporary. He's older than me, but he's from the same state. We're both from Minnesota, and he was a Minnesota chess master, one of the best we ever had that came out of the state. And he was really considered like one of the world's best chess players when it came to the King's Gambit. So it's cool that I get to include one of his games here. He was a big fan of playing the Muzio Gambit with the white pieces. And I get to kind of include one of his games here that did go very well for white. After knight to e7, he continued with this move queen to h5, which of course is a fork. It forks the king and it forks the bishop on c5. And after queen g6, queen captures c5, the computer finally does just give major advantage white. So this is kind of the secondary issue, is that if white does get this piece back on the c5 square, it's very, very difficult for black to survive. White has only sacrificed a piece for his attack, and white, in fact, does have a huge attack. Now, I am going to show the rest of this game because it was a good finish, and of course Jack played very well. The game continued d6. We had bishop d6 with a discovered attack against the king. Knight to f5, queen takes c7, so now white is only down one pawn worth of material for this absolute monster attack. The game continued bishop to d7, then we had knight to d2, just developing, rook to c8, queen takes b7, queen d6, rook takes f5 check, king to g6, rook g5 check, the whole point being that after king takes g5, we have knight e4 with another fork, very pretty fork against the king and the queen. So now after king h5, knight takes queen, and of course black could have resigned last move or this move. It doesn't really make a difference. The game is basically over, but I guess the game continued for a few more moves just for fun. We had rook c2, queen f3, king g5, h4 check, king takes h4, queen e4 check, and then finally black resigns, but I mean he could have done that a couple moves ago. Again, that was Jack Yost versus Baron, played in Toronto back in 2011. So if we go back to kind of the inception of this, maybe knight e7 isn't such a great move, but it's not clear that anything is much better. There is this threat of knight c3 d5, and there's also this auxiliary threat of simply queen h5 picking up this bishop on the c5 square. So this is an additional threat that we have to be concerned about. So how do we meet both of them? Well, one option is you could try something like d6, which protects the bishop on c5. What happens here? Well, according to the engine, knight c3 isn't even the best move, just queen h5. Because the king has to move, and he has to move to a dark square. He has to move somewhere not terribly desirable. If, for example, if we don't move the king, like if we play queen g6, bishop takes d6 check is very, very strong. This is decisive advantage white. So if the king moves to any of these dark squares, this bishop on f4 is going to be moving somewhere to hurt the king. So if, for example, king g7, we'd have a very pretty finish. Bishop h6 check, and of course we have this discovered attack where the rook is attacking the queen. So we would have something like queen takes h6, and then queen f7 is mate. So that would be a very pretty finish there. If we had something like king f8, for example, same problem. Bishop h6 check. The rook is attacking the queen. That's game over. If we had king to e7, bishop g5 is, pinning the queen to the king. We're winning the queen again. So what other options do we have? Well, we could move to a light square, I guess. We could move to the only light square that's legal. That would be the e6 square is available to us. But if we play king to e6, we would have rook e1 check, and now if queen e5, bishop takes e5, we're winning the queen again. So it seems like the only logical move is to move the king. However, if king to d7, pause the video and see if you can find it, queen e8 is in fact checkmate. And that is the end of the game. So pawn to d6, as logical as it looks, is probably also a game loser. So what do? Well, knight c6 is what my engine gives, and then I'll just give the engine analysis. It's just developing. Knight c3, d6, knight e4, queen f5, knight takes c5, d takes c5, queen e3. This is all, again, engine analysis. Queen g6, bishop e5 check, bishop f5, bishop takes h8, knight on g to e7, bishop e5, slide edge white. So that's the engine analysis. So it seems like when I look at things on the engine and when I go deep, the engine actually seems to like white in the pure Muzio Gambit. Like just starting after queen f6, it seems like if you go deep enough, the engine eventually will like the white side of it, even though the position is still wildly unclear. And of course, the initial engine assessment is very much in favor of black. So it's very difficult to figure out exactly what's going on here. And that's really kind of the appeal of the Muzio Gambit. So remember, at the beginning of this video, I said this video was about the Muzio Gambit and the Fischer Defense. And that's because the Fischer Defense presents a very interesting problem for a repertoire. And, of course, it presents an interesting problem for people that want to play the Muzio as well. Even if in the Muzio Gambit you're totally willing to just play with a slight disadvantage, bishop g7, and then you're willing to do something like this, like d4, d6, h4, h6, and then just continue with what should be, at least according to the engine, the best move, instead of playing c3, which seems like it's just advantage black in every possible way, even though this was something that was played between Nakamura and Ivanchuk back in 2010, and Nakamura still managed to get a draw. The engine really loves black in these positions. It seems like the move is, something like knight c3, and then you would run into something like, for instance, knight to c6. I do have also a little bit of analysis on this bishop e6 move, which is very rare, played very few times, but I do have a little bit of analysis on it, where apparently the best that white can do is do something like exchange, takes, exchange on h8, but then very importantly needs to play e5 right away. And this position is actually very unclear. For example, after queen e7, queen d3 makes two kind of interesting threats. So we have sort of an unclear position, in exchange for a pawn. So that's one option. But, we could have knight c6, and then what do we do here? Well, again, it's something like queen d3, bishop g4, bishop d5, bishop d7, bishop takes, bishop d2, queen f6, e5, d takes e5, h takes g5, queen g6, exchange, takes, castles queenside, exchange, and then eventually we can just kind of pick on this pawn on the g5 square. We can get it, and then the pawn on f4 shouldn't have enough defense. So at the very least, this endgame is equal, and white should be okay. So that's like a really long kind of computer line that I came up with. But the short answer is after h6, you can play knight c3, and maybe this position is fine. Like maybe white's doing okay here. So if you're running into the Fischer Defense, and if you have the Muzio in your repertoire, and if you're trying to avoid this position where maybe black is slightly better, or at the very least black has obtained complete equality, and you're not getting the types of attacks you want, what do you do? What are your options? And here's where things get kind of interesting. Because when I was talking about the Fischer Defense, when I was talking about d6 and talking about the Fischer Defense, one of the lines I brought up was pawn to d4, pawn to g5, and then this h4 move to avoid the equalizing prospects of bishop to c4, bishop g7, h4, h6. Where black is at least equal, but maybe slight edge black. So in order to avoid that, we would have to play h4, g4, and then knight g1 lately hasn't been promising for white. So maybe this knight g5 move is another direction we could go. And I mentioned that it was Muzio-esque in my very first King's Gambit video. And that's where understanding the Muzio and understanding the compensation of the Muzio comes into play. Because, we do have this game, Mirosevic versus Kasparov, played in Paris back in 1995, that continued with this h6, knight f7, king f7, bishop takes f4, which I cover in my first video, so I won't cover it again. But basically, white has a lot of Muzio-esque compensation, which might actually be okay for white. This leaves the other question, though. What do we do against pawn to f6, which is very similar to pawn to h6, but a little bit different, because the king will eventually threaten to castle? Well, we have to get that very similar Muzio-esque compensation. And the only way to do it is to play something like bishop takes f4, f takes g5, and then h takes g5. And these positions are very, very, very unclear. We have some compensation for the material. We're down a whole piece. But it's really unclear. The best I can come up with for best play, at least for the next couple moves, is knight c6, knight c3, bishop g7, and then shuffle this bishop back to e3. And at this point, it becomes very difficult to find games with absolute best play, because at least according to the engine, the absolute best move is knight on g to e7, which apparently nobody's played. I couldn't find a single game on it. So we're already in just out there kind of territory, and I did come up with a computer line that was kind of interesting. There's just Stockfish playing Stockfish. It was just everybody developing, and none of these moves are by any means forced, so there's possible improvements here as well. But queen d2, d5, castles queenside, bishop e6, g6, and apparently you can't take the pawn in any meaningful way, so h5 is the best move. Bishop g5, queen d7, bishop b5, castles queenside, bishop c6, knight c6, e d5, bishop d5, bishop d8, queen d8, and then king b1, knight d4, according to the engine, was somewhere between slight edge and major advantage black. But of course, as you can see, the position is still pretty unclear. It's two pieces for a rook, and there's a little bit of unclarity here. There's this pawn on g6, which is either a weakness or it's a thorn pawn, and there's still a little bit to debate here. But there's probably a little bit to debate just even going back all the way to queen d2. It's not so clear, if that line was by any means, a forced continuation, or if there was some other improvement in there. So still kind of a fertile ground for some sort of exploration here. But what if you want to avoid this? Because at least according to the engine right now, this is somewhere between slight edge to major advantage black if they know this, or if they've looked at it on their computer, and if you can't find any kind of improvement. What's the alternative? What can you play with the white pieces? Well, in the Muzio, we just play bishop c4, so can we play bishop c4? And bishop c4 is reasonable. It's very, very reasonable here. So bishop c4, one of the cool things behind bishop c4 is if they play the immediate g5, they can't quite get away with it. Because if they play g5, now h4, g4, and then knight g5 is very good for white. And actually, this was played in a very cool game. This was played in Spassky versus Borowski, played back in Reno in 2004. The game continued bishop e6, I guess to prevent the attack on f7. And then knight e6, f e6, queen g4, knight to f6, queen takes e6 check, queen e7, queen c8, queen back to c8, bishop takes f7, which is cute, because if king takes f7, we have queen takes queen, winning the queen. So they actually finished the game with king to e7, and then queen e6 mate. So kind of a very cute game there. But needless to say, g5 is not great simply because of h4, g5, and then knight g5. And this is not, this is a double attack on the f7 square. This is perfectly acceptable for white. White's actually just doing quite well here. There's nothing bad going on in this position for white. So white's doing fine after h4, g4, knight g5. So the correct move for black, at least according to the engine and according to the theory, is to play something like pawn to h6, and then against a normal move, like pawn to d4, we're going to have this same line, g5, h4, bishop g7, and as we've already established, this is somewhere between equality and slight edge black. So if you're okay with this, and you're going to get to this from this move order anyway, you might as well have the Muzio in your move order. Because, you can get to this from the Muzio move order. But there is also a way that you can try to avoid this if you just want to play this move order independently. After bishop to c4 and then h6, you could try the move pawn to h4, which mechanically prevents pawn to g5. So this makes life very, very interesting. And it's not really clear which one of these two moves is better, like if h4 is better or d4 is better. But I do have this game, Gallagher versus Fleer, played in Hastings back in 1992. Continued with knight to f6, which is kind of the consensus best move. And then we have knight to c3, and then we have knight to c6, and then we have pawn to d4, going after the middle of the board and also going after the pawn on f4. So then we have this knight h5, holding that pawn on f4 with the knight, which is essential. You have to hold the shield pawn. And then we have d5, knight e7, knight d4, knight to g3, and then the game continued rook to h2, and the position was still very unclear, and eventually the game did end in a draw. Apparently rook h3, as crazy as that move looks, putting the rook right on a square where the bishop can take it, is slight edge white, according to the engine. So, like, apparently the last thing you want to do is trade off your light-scored bishop in this position, according to the engine. You're not going to be doing very good, for starters, once this bishop takes on the f4 square, this knight actually won't have a square where it can land safely. Also, there's big weaknesses on the light squares with moves like bishop b5, or the queen coming into the game with queen to g4, so you actually don't want to take the rook. It's not so clear that you want to take the rook, but if you don't take the rook, you also have bishop takes f4 as a problem, and when bishop takes f4 happens, that knight on g3 is going to be double attacked. So at least according to the engine, rook h3 is slight edge white, and that could have been played. So I would definitely fit this into a repertoire, and I would definitely put this as a line that I'm willing to play, beginning with this move pawn to h4, because potentially this position is okay for white. Potentially this is at least equal, if not slightly better for white, even though the engine will initially spit out the assessment of the opposite of that. It'll say equal, slightly better for black, but any experience in the King's Gambit will tell you that, in the Muzio Gambit, it gives decisive advantage black, and then if you run the line 5 moves deep, it says advantage white. So this is what we deal with in the King's Gambit all the time when analyzing, and when analyzing with engines. The engines might tell you that these positions are equal or advantage black, but you have to analyze deeper, and then in reality you might find out that these positions actually white has an awful lot of compensation. And of course that's just the nature of the position in general. White's compensation is more long-term in the King's Gambit. White has a better center. White has the prospect of better future deployment and better future development. Black has the more immediate advantage of just having the extra pawn, and of course the very real tactical and strategic advantage of having this shield pawn on the f4 square, which will prevent attacks down the F file. And these are the things that people need to work around, and these are the things that people need to deal with. So anyways, that's my video on the Muzio Gambit and the Fischer Defense, and what you might need to do to fit things into your repertoire. So just kind of reviewing, I am saying that you have this dual option of trying to play the Muzio Gambit with bishop to c4, and going into the Muzio, but if you do this, you have to have this move bishop to g7, pawn to d4, pawn to d6, h4, h6 in your repertoire, where I recommend the move knight to c3, and this position is unclear. And of course, if you have this in your repertoire, you will also be playing the same thing against the Fischer Defense with d6, bishop to c4, or in this case, you can even get to it by force with d4, g5, and then h4, d4, g5, and then bishop to c4, bishop g7, h4, h6 will get you to the same spot, and you can simply play knight to c3. And then, of course, the secondary kind of recommendation of this video is to avoid this line where after pawn to d6 in the Fischer Defense, you're going to be playing d4, g5, h4, g5, knight to g5, because maybe you don't want to deal with the move pawn to f6. And if you don't want to deal with the move pawn to f6, the way that you avoid it is, again, you throw in this bishop c4, where you're going to be dealing with h6, and here I recommend either going back into that line, which is either equality or possibly slight edge black, as long as you're okay with that, or avoiding it completely with pawn to h4, which is kind of the path that I would go down, is to play something like pawn to h4. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.